They poured a drink on the Maid in front of 200 guests, not knowing the billionaire was watching. "You don't belong in this room." The wine glass shattered against the marble floor, red liquid dripping down the Maid's face like blood. 200 guests froze. Champagne glasses hung mid-air. Somewhere near the grand staircase, a man in a black tuxedo lowered his phone and simply watched. He didn't gasp. He didn't move. He just watched because he already knew something none of them did. And in exactly 4 minutes, that ballroom would never be the same again. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional, twist-filled journeys we've ever brought you. A story about pride, cruelty, hidden identity, and the kind of justice that arrives when you least expect it. This is a tale of family, forgiveness, and the truth that always finds its way to the light. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? Stay with us until the very end, because what happens in this story will change the way you look at kindness forever. Marisol Vega had exactly $47 in her bank account and a secret she'd carried for 11 years. The rain hit the windows of the small apartment in Queens like impatient fingers tapping glass, and Marisol Vega stood in front of a cracked mirror, pinning her dark hair into a tight bun. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold but from nerves. Tonight was the biggest catering job of her life, the engagement gala of Nathaniel Whitfield, heir to Whitfield Industries, one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. "You're going to be amazing," her mother Rosa said from the kitchen, stirring a pot of beans that would be dinner for the next 3 nights. Rosa's hands were rough from decades of cleaning other people's homes, but her eyes still held warmth, the kind of warmth that never dimmed no matter how hard life pressed down on her. "It's just serving drinks, Mama," Marisol said, forcing a smile. "Nothing special." But it wasn't nothing. The catering agency paid double for events at the Whitfield estate, and double meant Marisol could finally afford her daughter Sophia's asthma medication without skipping her own meals for 2 weeks straight. Sophia was only 6, asleep now in the next room, her small chest rising and falling with the faint whistle that always made Marisol's heart clench. Marisol hadn't always lived like this. Once, her family had been comfortable, not wealthy but stable. Her father had owned a small auto repair shop in Newark. Then he got sick. The medical bills swallowed everything. The shop, the house, the savings. He passed away when Marisol was 19, and the family never recovered financially. She'd been working ever since, cleaning houses, waiting tables, catering events for people who would never remember her name. There was one part of her past, though, that Marisol never spoke about. A single gold pendant, shaped like a small sunflower, sat hidden in a velvet pouch at the bottom of her dresser drawer. She hadn't worn it in years. It reminded her of a woman she'd loved deeply and lost, a woman named Eleanor, who had shown her more kindness in 2 years than most people showed in a lifetime. But that story was locked away, buried under bills and exhaustion and the daily grind of survival. Tonight, she told herself, was just another job. The town car sent by the catering agency picked up the staff at 6 sharp. Marisol sat quietly among the other servers, listening to them gossip about the Whitfield family. How the old patriarch had died 2 years ago, how young Nathaniel had taken over the company and doubled its value, how he was finally getting engaged to socialite Victoria Sterling after a whirlwind 8-month romance. "She's stunning," one server whispered. "But cold. I worked her birthday party last year. She made a girl cry over folded napkins." Marisol said nothing. She'd learned long ago that the wealthy world operated on rules she didn't need to understand, only survive. The Whitfield estate rose out of the New Jersey countryside like something from a fairy tale. White stone, endless windows glowing gold, a fountain out front spraying water lit up in soft blue light. Marisol's breath caught despite herself. She had catered nice events before, but nothing like this. Inside, the ballroom was a universe of chandeliers and white roses, string quartets playing softly as 200 of the wealthiest people on the eastern seaboard mingled in gowns and tuxedos worth more than Marisol's annual salary. She kept her head down, moving through the crowd with a silver tray of champagne, invisible in the way service staff are trained to be invisible. She caught glimpses of the bride-to-be across the room, Victoria Sterling, blonde and radiant in a deep blue sequined gown, laughing loudly at something a guest said, her diamond engagement ring catching the chandelier light every time she moved her hand. She was beautiful undeniably. But there was something sharp in the way she looked at the staff, something that made Marisol's stomach tighten every time Victoria's eyes swept past her. Marisol didn't see the groom yet. Nathaniel Whitfield was somewhere in the crowd, shaking hands, playing the perfect host. She wasn't looking for him. She had no reason to. 2 hours into the event, disaster struck in the smallest possible way. The kind of small mistake that changes everything. A guest, an older man with too much champagne in his system, stumbled backward directly into Marisol's tray. Glasses toppled. Red wine, someone's abandoned drink from a side table, splashed across the front of a nearby woman's white dress before Marisol could even react. The woman spun around. It was Victoria. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. "Are you serious?" Victoria's voice cracked through the music like a whip. The quartet faltered mid-note. Heads turned. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I'm so sorry, ma'am, it was an accident," the gentleman bumped into. "I don't care whose fault it was," Victoria snapped, stepping closer, her face flushed with fury and champagne. "You people are supposed to be careful. This is a $200,000 dress and a $12,000 custom gown fitting, and you just ruined it because you can't hold a tray straight." Marisol's hands shook as she reached for napkins. "Let me help you clean it, Don't touch me." Victoria's voice rose another octave, and now every eye in the ballroom was fixed on the two women. Marisol felt her face burning, felt 200 pairs of eyes crawling across her skin like insects. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone was already rising to record. "You know what?" Victoria said, reaching for a fresh glass of red wine from a passing tray, her eyes narrowing with cruel, calculated intent. "Since you clearly don't understand the value of things you can't afford, let me show you what it feels like." "Victoria, don't," someone near her whispered, but it was too late. The wine arced through the air in slow motion, red droplets catching the golden chandelier light like falling rubies, and struck Marisol full in the face. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence swallowed the ballroom. Marisol stood frozen, wine dripping down her cheeks, soaking into the collar of her yellow uniform. Her vision blurred by liquid and unshed tears she refused to let fall in front of these people. "You don't belong in this room," Victoria said, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, her chin lifted triumphant. And that was the exact moment a man near the grand staircase lowered his phone from where he'd been reviewing a business text, looked up and saw everything. Nathaniel Whitfield did not move, did not gasp, did not rush forward like a hero in a movie. He simply watched, his jaw tightening, something cold and unreadable settling into his expression, because Nathaniel Whitfield had just recognized something on the humiliated woman's dripping face that made his entire body go still. A small gold sunflower pendant, now soaked in wine, hanging from her neck. He knew that pendant. He had watched his mother clasp it around someone's neck with her own dying hands, 3 years ago, in a hospital room that smelled of lilies and goodbye. What happens when a man realizes the woman being humiliated in front of everyone he knows is the one person his mother begged him to find? Nathaniel Whitfield hadn't cried in 3 years, until he saw wine dripping from a woman he thought he'd lost forever. Nathaniel's mind raced backward, 11 years compressing into a single memory that hit him like a freight train. His mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when Nathaniel was 26, freshly graduated from business school, still learning the weight of the Whitfield name. The disease moved fast, faster than the doctors predicted, and within 8 months, Eleanor was confined to a hospital bed in the west wing of their estate, too weak to walk, her once vibrant laugh reduced to a whisper. The family had hired professional nurses, but none of them lasted. Eleanor was difficult in her illness. Not cruel, but stubborn, prideful, unwilling to be treated like a dying woman instead of a person. Nurse after nurse quit within weeks. Then came Marisol. She wasn't even supposed to be there that day. She'd been sent as a temporary replacement through an agency when the scheduled caregiver called in sick. Nathaniel remembered walking past his mother's room and hearing, for the first time in months, genuine laughter. Marisol hadn't treated Eleanor like a fragile, dying woman. She'd argued with her about telenovelas playing on the small TV in the corner, snuck her forbidden chocolate when the doctors weren't looking, told her stories about her own daughter Sophia, who was just a baby then, and somehow, impossibly, made Eleanor Whitfield feel alive again in her final months. Nathaniel had been so consumed by grief and the responsibilities suddenly thrust upon him. His father was already gone by then, and the company was crumbling under bad decisions, that he barely spoke to the young caregiver who spent 16-hour days with his mother. He regretted that now deeply. He regretted a lot of things about that year. What he remembered clearly, though, was the final week. Eleanor had called him into her room, her voice barely above a whisper, and pressed something into his hand, a small velvet pouch containing a gold sunflower pendant that had belonged to Eleanor's own mother. "Give this to Marisol," she'd said, her breathing labored. Tell her she gave me my dignity back when I had nothing left. Tell her if she or her daughter ever need anything, Nathaniel, the Whitfield family owes her a debt that money can't repay. Promise me you'll find her if she ever disappears. Promise me you won't let her be forgotten." Nathaniel had promised. And then his mother died 4 days later, and in the chaos of funeral arrangements, inheriting a failing company, and the sudden crushing weight of being the last Whitfield standing, he had done the unthinkable. He lost track of her. The agency Marisol worked for had closed. Her phone number changed. Nathaniel told himself he'd find her eventually, that there was time, that grief needed to settle first. Weeks became months. Months became years. The promise calcified into guilt, and guilt, unaddressed, eventually became something he simply stopped looking at directly. A locked door in the back of his mind he walked past every single day without opening. Until tonight. Until wine dripped down a stranger's face in his own ballroom, and he saw a small gold sunflower catch the chandelier light. "Nathaniel!" Victoria's voice cut through his memory. She was standing beside him now, having crossed the ballroom, her face still flushed with satisfaction rather than shame. "Did you see that? I can't believe the audacity of these people. I'm going to have the agency fire her tonight." Nathaniel didn't answer. He was already moving. He crossed the ballroom in long, purposeful strides, guests parting around him like water around a ship's hull, whispers rising in his wake. Marisol stood exactly where she'd been humiliated, wine still dripping from her chin, her whole body rigid with the effort of not crying in front of 200 strangers. "I am so sorry, sir, I'll clean this up right away, she started, assuming he was another wealthy guest coming to reprimand her further. "Marisol." Nathaniel's voice cracked, barely above a whisper, but the ballroom had gone quiet enough that it carried. Marisol froze. Slowly, she lifted her wine-streaked face and looked at him properly for the first time, really looked, and her lips parted in shock. "Nathaniel," she breathed. "Eleanor's son. Oh my God. You know him." Victoria's voice rang out, confused, the first crack of uncertainty entering her tone. Nathaniel ignored his fiancée entirely. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a handkerchief, and without a hint of hesitation, gently began wiping the wine from Marisol's face himself, in front of every single one of his guests. His business partners, his fiancée, and the small army of phones now openly recording. "I have been looking for you for 3 years, Nathaniel said quietly. his voice thick with an emotion the crowd had never seen from the notoriously composed Whitfield heir. "My mother made me promise. And I failed her. I failed you." Whispers exploded across the ballroom like static electricity. "Wait," someone murmured. "Whitfield knows the maid." "That's not just any maid," another voice added, phone raised higher. Victoria's face had drained of color, her earlier triumph curdling into something like panic. "Nathaniel, what is going on? Who is this woman?" Nathaniel turned to face his fiancée for the first time since crossing the room, and something in his eyes had changed. A coldness that hadn't been there an hour earlier, when he'd toasted their engagement in front of these same guests. "This woman," he said slowly, deliberately, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "spent the final 8 months of my mother's life giving her more joy, dignity, and laughter than this entire family combined. My mother's dying wish was that I find her and make sure she and her daughter never wanted for anything again." He paused, and the silence in the ballroom was so complete Marisol could hear her own heartbeat. "And you," Nathaniel continued, turning back to Victoria, "just threw a glass of wine in her face in front of 200 people because she spilled a drink she didn't even cause." "Nathaniel, I didn't know. How could I have known?" Victoria's voice pitched higher, panic bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. "That's exactly the problem," Nathaniel said quietly. "You didn't need to know who she was to treat her with basic human decency. You needed to know that she was a person." Marisol stood frozen between them, wine-soaked and trembling, suddenly the center of a collision she never asked to be part of. Caught between a debt of gratitude 11 years old and a humiliation only minutes fresh, unsure which emotion to trust as 200 strangers watched her entire world tilt sideways. What would you do if you were in her place? Forgiven and pitied in the very same breath, in front of everyone who just watched you be broken. Victoria Sterling had 30 seconds to save her engagement, and she chose to make everything so much worse. The ballroom had transformed into something between a courtroom and a theater, 200 guests no longer bothering to hide their staring, phones held at chest height, recording everything with the casual cruelty of people who knew they were witnessing something that would trend online by morning. Victoria's mind raced. 8 months of careful planning. The engagement, the seating charts, the prenup negotiations her lawyer had spent weeks on, the vision board of her future life as Mrs. Whitfield. All of it suddenly balanced on a knife's edge in front of the most important people in her social circle. She did what she always did when cornered. She attacked. "Oh, please," Victoria said, forcing a laugh that came out brittle and wrong. "So your mother had a favorite nurse. That's sweet, Nathaniel, truly. But that doesn't excuse the fact that this woman ruined a $200,000 dress with a wine glass she was too clumsy to hold properly. An accident that wasn't even her fault," Nathaniel said. "I watched the whole thing. A guest bumped into her. It doesn't matter whose fault it was." Victoria's composure cracked fully now, her voice climbing toward something shrill and desperate. "These people are hired to be careful. That's literally their entire job. If she can't handle a simple serving tray, she shouldn't be working events like this." Something in the crowd shifted, a low murmur of discomfort rippling through guests who, moments earlier, had watched Victoria's outburst with passive curiosity but were now beginning to recalculate exactly how this story would be told at brunch tomorrow. Marisol, still trembling, finally found her voice. "I don't need anyone to defend me," she said quietly, though her hands were shaking as she said it. "I've been humiliated by wealthier people than you before, Ms. Sterling. I'll clean myself up and finish my shift." She turned to walk away, toward the kitchen, toward anonymity, toward the version of tonight where she simply survived it and went home to Sophia, but Nathaniel caught her arm gently. "No," he said. "You're not finishing this shift. You're not a maid tonight, Marisol. You're my guest." "Nathaniel." Victoria's voice cracked with disbelief. "I need to tell you something," Nathaniel said, turning to address not just Marisol, not just Victoria, but the entire ballroom. His voice steady now, carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent 2 years learning to run a company through sheer force of will. 3 years ago, my mother was dying. This woman gave up better-paying jobs, steadier jobs, safer jobs, to care for a stranger's mother because the agency needed someone and no one else would do it. She sat with my mother through chemotherapy sessions. She held her hand during nights when the pain medication wasn't enough. She made a dying woman laugh again. His voice wavered just slightly, and for the first time in the entire evening, the untouchable Whitfield composure cracked open to reveal genuine grief underneath. My mother's last request to me, her literal dying words, were to find this woman and make sure she was taken care of. And I failed. I let my grief and my responsibilities consume me, and I lost track of her for 3 years while she was out there struggling. And tonight I find her again working as a server at my own engagement party, and the first thing that happens is my fiancé throws wine in her face. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, an older woman's voice rang out. Clear, sharp, unmistakable. I remember Eleanor mentioning her. She told me herself, at the last charity gala she attended before she got too sick to leave the house. She said the caregiver treated her like a person, not a patient. It was Margaret Chen, Eleanor's oldest and closest friend, a woman whose social standing in this circle was second only to the Whitfields themselves. Every head in the ballroom turned toward her. Eleanor talked about her constantly in those last months, Margaret continued, stepping forward, her eyes fixed on Marisol with something like recognition and wonder. She said this young caregiver reminded her what kindness actually looked like, after decades of surrounding herself with people who only wanted something from her. Victoria's face had gone from flushed to pale to something almost gray. She could feel the room's collective judgment shifting, feel 200 pairs of eyes recalculating everything they thought they knew about her, feel the future she'd spent 8 months constructing beginning to crumble in real time. "This is insane," she said, her voice pitching upward again, defensive and cornered. "So what, I'm supposed to apologize to the help because she has some sentimental backstory with your dead mother? Nathaniel, our engagement party is happening right now, in front of everyone who matters to our future, and you're choosing to have some emotional breakdown over a nurse you haven't seen in 3 years. The word help landed in the room like a slap. Nathaniel's expression, which had been pained and conflicted moments earlier, hardened into something final. "You just called the woman who gave my dying mother her last moments of joy the help," he said quietly. "In front of 200 people. Twice tonight, actually. First with wine, now with words." "Nathaniel, I think," Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously calm now, "that you just showed everyone in this room exactly who you are, Victoria. And I think I've been too busy building a company to notice it happening for the last 8 months. Victoria's hand flew to her chest, her engagement ring catching the light one final, glittering time. "You cannot be serious right now. You are not doing this. Not here. Not like this." But Marisol, standing wine-streaked and stunned in the center of the ballroom, watched something in Nathaniel's face that told her he was, in fact, entirely serious, and that whatever happened next in this room would be talked about long after the last champagne glass was cleared away. Nobody in that ballroom expected the night to end with a ring being taken off. But the biggest twist was still coming, and it had nothing to do with Victoria at all. 3 days later, a lawyer knocked on Marisol's apartment door, and what he carried inside his briefcase would change her family's life forever. The engagement officially ended that night, though "ended" felt like too gentle a word for what actually happened. Nathaniel removed his grandmother's ring, the one Victoria wore, passed down through 3 generations of Whitfield brides, right there in the ballroom, asked her quietly and firmly to return it, and had his head of security escort her to a car while 200 guests watched in stunned silence. By morning, video clips of the incident had spread across every platform imaginable. Billionaire calls off engagement after fiancé humiliates his late mother's caregiver, trended for 3 consecutive days. Victoria Sterling's social media accounts, once curated shrines of luxury and status, were flooded with comments from strangers dissecting every past post for signs of the cruelty they'd witnessed. Marisol wanted none of the attention. She went home that night, held Sophia while she slept and cried. Not from humiliation, but from the overwhelming collision of grief and gratitude that came with unexpectedly reliving her final months with Eleanor Whitfield, a woman she genuinely loved. She assumed that was the end of it. A viral moment, a strange coincidence. A story people would forget within a week. She went back to work at the catering agency 2 days later, embarrassed by the attention, hoping the whole thing would fade. Didn't. On the 3rd day, a knock came at her apartment door. Standing in the hallway was a man in an impeccable gray suit, holding a leather briefcase, looking distinctly out of place among the peeling paint and flickering hallway lights of Marisol's building. "Ms. Vega. My name is Robert Ashford. I'm the Whitfield family's estate attorney." Marisol's stomach dropped. "Is something wrong? Is Nathaniel?" "Nothing is wrong," Robert said gently, noting the panic in her voice. "May I come in? This concerns a provision in Eleanor Whitfield's will that was never properly executed." Confused, Marisol let him inside, hovering near the doorway as Sophia peeked curiously from the hallway before Marisol gently ushered her back to her room. Robert opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Eleanor Whitfield amended her will 11 days before she passed away. There was a provision naming you as a beneficiary, a trust intended for your care and your daughter's education, along with instructions that you be offered a permanent position managing the Whitfield Family Foundation's caregiver support program, should you ever want it. Marisol's hands flew to her mouth. "I don't understand. Nobody ever told me this." The provision required verification of identity and location, which fell through the cracks after Mrs. Whitfield's passing, during a difficult transitional period for the family. Robert explained carefully, clearly choosing his words to avoid placing blame on Nathaniel directly, though the implication was clear enough. "When Mr. Whitfield recognized you at the gala, he had our office reopen the file immediately." He slid the folder across the small kitchen table. Marisol stared at the numbers on the page. An amount that would have seemed like fiction to her 3 days earlier, enough to pay off every medical bill from her father's illness, enough to move Sophia into a home with actual heating that worked reliably, enough to guarantee her daughter's education from this moment through college. "Why would she do this?" Marisol whispered, tears sliding freely down her face now. "I was just doing my job." "From what I understand," Robert said gently, "Eleanor Whitfield didn't see it that way at all." That evening, Marisol sat on her fire escape after Sophia had fallen asleep, staring out at the Queen's skyline, the velvet pouch with the sunflower pendant clutched in her hand, thinking about a dying woman who had somehow found the strength, in her final painful weeks, to think not of her own suffering but of the young caregiver who'd made her laugh through it. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Nathaniel. I hope Robert reached you okay. I should have found you 3 years ago. I'm sorry it took an engagement party disaster to make it happen. If you ever want to talk about my mother about anything, I'd like that. No pressure." Marisol stared at the message for a long time before typing back a simple reply. "Thank you for keeping your promise, even 3 years late. Your mother would be proud of the man standing up in that ballroom." Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Sterling sat alone in her penthouse, scrolling through the wreckage of her public image, watching friendships evaporate in real time as invitations stopped arriving and her name became a punchline in gossip columns. For the first time in years, stripped of the engagement, the status, and the social armor she'd built so carefully, she was forced to sit with a question she'd been avoiding her entire adult life. When did I become someone who could do that to another human being? She thought about her own mother years ago, before the money, before the elite boarding schools and the calculated social climbing, a woman who used to tell her, "Kindness costs nothing, Vicky, but it's worth more than anything we own." She thought about the girl she used to be, before wealth had taught her that status was armor and vulnerability was weakness. She picked up her phone and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, dialed her mother's number instead of scrolling past it. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "I need to talk to you. I did something terrible." The question wasn't whether Victoria could change. The question was whether she'd finally chosen to want to. 6 months later, Marisol Vega stood in front of a different crowd, not as a maid, but as someone with something important to say. 6 months passed. Autumn had settled over the Whitfield Foundation's headquarters in Manhattan, where Marisol now worked full-time as the director of the newly launched Caregiver Support Initiative, a program funded by Eleanor's Trust, designed to provide financial assistance, healthcare benefits, and career development for in-home caregivers across the state, the very people who, like Marisol once had, gave everything of themselves while receiving almost nothing in return. Sophia, now 7, attended a private school with a dedicated pediatric asthma specialist on staff. Her medical needs no longer a source of nightly anxiety for her mother. She'd made friends. She laughed more. She no longer asked Marisol why they couldn't afford things other kids had. Nathaniel and Marisol had become close over those 6 months, not in the rushed, dramatic way tabloids had initially speculated, painting them as a fairy tale romance born from scandal, but slowly, genuinely, built on shared grief and mutual respect. He'd visit the foundation offices sometimes, not as her boss, but as a friend who'd finally kept his promise to his mother and found, in doing so, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Whether their relationship would become something more, neither of them rushed to define. For the first time in years, Marisol felt no pressure to fit into anyone else's timeline for her own life. The gala that evening, Eleanor Whitfield Memorial Foundation's first annual fundraiser, filled the same ballroom where everything had unfolded 6 months earlier. This time, though, the room felt different. Warmer. The chandeliers cast the same golden light, but the atmosphere had shifted from performative wealth to genuine purpose. Marisol stood at a podium near the front of the room, note cards trembling slightly in her hands, looking out at faces that included business leaders, philanthropists, former colleagues from her catering days whom she'd personally invited, and her own mother, Rosa, sitting proudly in the third row in a modest but beautiful dress Marisol had bought her for the occasion. 6 months ago, I stood in this exact room in a very different position, Marisol began, her voice steadying as she spoke. I was invisible then by design. Service staff are trained to be unseen, to move through rooms like ghosts. That night, I became visible in the worst possible way, humiliated in front of everyone here. A hush fell over the crowd. But that humiliation led me back to a promise made by a remarkable woman I had the privilege of caring for in her final months, Eleanor Whitfield, who taught me that kindness isn't about the size of your bank account. It's about how you treat someone who has absolutely nothing to offer you in return. She looked toward the back of the room, where a figure had quietly slipped in, standing near the entrance, listening. Victoria Sterling. Gasps rippled through pockets of the crowd who recognized her. The disgraced socialite whose name had become synonymous with cruelty 6 months earlier. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, her presence deliberately understated, standing near the exit as though prepared to leave the moment she became unwelcome. Marisol paused, and then, to the visible shock of everyone watching, she smiled gently and gestured toward her. Victoria reached out to me 2 months ago. She spent the last several months volunteering anonymously at a caregiver support shelter in the Bronx. Not for publicity, since she specifically asked that it never be photographed or publicized. She told me she wanted to understand firsthand what it actually means to serve people who have nothing, instead of judging people who have less than she does. Victoria's eyes glistened, her chin dipping slightly, overwhelmed. I'm not telling you this because people don't deserve consequences for their actions, Marisol continued. They do. Victoria hurt me deeply that night, and it took real work. Work I watched her do, quietly without seeking credit for it, to begin becoming someone different. I'm telling you this because I believe people can change, if they're willing to actually do the uncomfortable work of changing, instead of just apologizing and expecting forgiveness to arrive automatically. She turned back to the crowd, her voice growing stronger. My father used to tell me that the measure of a person isn't how they treat people who can help them. It's how they treat people who can't. Tonight, this foundation exists to make sure the caregivers, the nurses, the maids, the people who spend their lives serving others quietly and without recognition, finally get seen. Not just when something goes viral, but every single day. The room rose in applause, and Marisol caught Nathaniel's eyes from where he stood near the front. His expression full of a pride and warmth that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the woman his mother had loved enough to fight for, even from her deathbed. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Marisol found herself alone with Victoria near the same spot where the wine had been thrown 6 months earlier. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Victoria said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that what happened that night, it broke something in me that needed to break. I'd been so afraid of losing my status that I'd forgotten how to be a person underneath it. You didn't deserve what I did to you. Nobody does." Marisol studied her for a long moment. "I forgave you months ago," she said finally. "Not because what you did was okay, but because carrying that anger wasn't going to help Sophia sleep better at night. And it wasn't going to bring your old self back either. You have to do that part yourself." Victoria nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me as someone who could change, when I gave you every reason not to." As Victoria left, Nathaniel approached, wrapping a light jacket around Marisol's shoulders against the autumn chill drifting in through the open ballroom doors. "My mother would have loved tonight," he said softly. Marisol looked up at the chandeliers, remembering a dying woman's laughter, a promise made and eventually kept, and a small gold sunflower pendant that had somehow, against every reasonable odd, changed the course of an entire family's future. "She's the reason any of this happened," Marisol said. "I just tried to live up to what she believed about me. Some promises take years to keep, but the ones worth keeping always find their way back to the people who deserve them." 6 months after being humiliated in front of 200 strangers, Marisol Vega stood in that same ballroom as a woman who had rebuilt not just her own life, but the lives of countless caregivers who would now be seen, supported, and valued because of a promise a dying woman refused to let her son forget. The lesson of this story isn't that wealth guarantees cruelty, or that poverty guarantees virtue. It's simpler than that. The way you treat someone who cannot benefit you is the truest measure of who you are. Kindness given freely without expectation of return has a way of finding its way back to you, sometimes years later, in the most unexpected moments. And for those who make mistakes, who let status and fear turn them into someone they never wanted to become, change is always possible, but only through the humble, unglamorous work of actually becoming better, not just apologizing for being worse. If this story moved you, made you think about the people in your own life who deserve to be seen, the caregivers, the workers, the quiet helpers who rarely get thanked, please hit that like button and let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story like this one. And if someone in your life needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way back around, share this video with them today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.